Good morning, everyone. I am calling the Finance and Administration Committee meeting for Tuesday, April 14th, 2026 to order. My name is Jim Spear. I'm the chair of this committee. The vice chair is Michael Gaudini, and the third council member of this committee is Mike Salmonson. And we have with us, of course, Meg Dobbs, the borough manager, and Emily Pisano, assistant manager, and the mayor. Dana Edwards is here in the audience. And let's get to approval of March minutes. I have a motion.
So moved.
Second.
Everyone at a glance, the March minutes. Then let's vote it in. All in favor of accepting the March minutes? That's 3-0 accepted. Thank you. Okay, are we going to insert Adam here? Questions for Adam?
Are we doing that? Well, do we have to do the review of budget versus actual now, or are we taking the agenda out of order?
I can give a quick review of the treasurer's report,
Okay,
and then
report. Thanks.
I mean, yeah, it'll take just a couple minutes to get to the agenda item, so we can stick to the.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure, treasurer's report.
Okay. So this is tax season. Most people in the borough do pay their taxes during the discount period. So you'll note in this month, and then as well when you receive the April, the majority of our taxes have been received at this point, which is reflected in the March budget here. So we are looking pretty flush with cash. At this point, what I would like to do is to request of the committee the authorization to go ahead and make the transfer of the $500,000 that we had budgeted from the general fund to go into our capital fund. So that's going to go in our capital fund reserve, which has the highest interest rate yields. So that money will sit in there. And then I'm working also on our cash reserve policy, which I know we've talked about for a while. I would like to have a draft before you for next month for that. But right now we do not need all of that money sitting in our general fund. So I want to go ahead and transfer that $500,000 that we budgeted from general fund to the capital fund now that we have all of our taxes more or less in the bank. So that's one thing. So I'm going to pause right there to see if there's any comment or question on that.
No.
That's
good.
Makes sense.
Great. So
Yeah,
I'll go ahead
yeah.
and take care of that. So you'll see that then in the budget numbers for next month. And then the other thing I wanted just to quickly point out is that there was a transfer of $69,000. I don't know exactly, but the $69,000 transfer from our general fund to our highway aid fund. This is a result of our 2022-2023 liquid fuels audit. Found that we did not supply correct documentation to support the expenditure of our liquid fuels monies for the expenditures that we did, and that was related to the LED upgrades for our streetlights. I had attempted last year to recover those documents to try to qualify the payment. That effort was ultimately unsuccessful. And so the state, in order to then release our funds for 2026 for our liquid fuels allocation, required us to make that transfer back to our highway aid fund. So we did make that transfer. That has now released our 2026 liquid fuels fund. So we have not yet received those, but they are going to be coming out of the hold to be released to us, which we'll receive in time for our expenditure for our 2026 road program. But what that means is that then we have the $69,000 that had been paid for out of liquid fuels that is now coming out of general fund.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that we're going to work on this year, though, is that we do have a number of qualifying expenditures that we can apply as liquid fuels dollars. We just generally choose not to because of the amount of administrative time that it takes to document all of these, and also because we don't have the extra funds, because essentially what the money is in our liquid fuels is what we spend on our road program. So we don't really have a lot of extra money. What we're going to do is we're going to then pull the other eligible expenses, which again are eligible. We just choose not to apply the liquid fuels just from a budgeting perspective and an administrative perspective, but to essentially recover that $69,000 from our general fund. So those expenditures that would otherwise come out of general fund that are eligible for liquid fuels, we are going to be applying, we're going to be documenting those, classifying them in our liquid fuels funds as the eligible expenses that they are, to then offset essentially that transfer that we made. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
But, okay, it makes sense until the very end, and I'm like, but does that mean overall we have less money for other things that could be paid for in liquid funds or?
So the choice then for that is, since we paid back the liquid fuels fund, the highway aid fund out of general fund, that means that we have $69,000 more in our liquid fuels. But between what we have and what we're allocated for the year, that's covering our
Okay.
expenses
Okay.
for our road program.
Okay,
So we don't necessarily need the money this year. The only benefit to leaving it in and not worrying about the additional transfer or classification of the funds would be if you wanted to bank that for future years. But we had talked about this when we were doing the budgeting process. I think
Right.
it's more prudent for us to game plan a longer budget strategy. The $69,000 won't really get us very far in terms of future budgeting. So I think it's better to kind of look at it more holistically than try to do a piecemeal.
okay.
Yeah, so the way that we're doing it. Because that is, something you mentioned earlier in your discussion was my understanding was that when we're funding things out of liquid fuels. There's certain things we can fund out, which just involve more. Justification or document.
It's documentation, yeah. It's administrative time to document those funds.
So the way that you propose doing it minimizes that. Or does it involve us, I guess, let me just ask that, the way that we're doing it, proposed to do it, minimizes the amount of time that we're spending on the documentation?
We are going to be spending the time on the documentation this year
Okay.
to essentially recoup that $69,000. Because again, so the street lights, the actual cost, like the Pico bills for the street lights are eligible for liquid fuels. We just choose not to pay for them out of liquid fuels funding
Yeah.
because it takes extra documentation.
So I guess my question is gonna be as follows, which is. Going forward, like, does it make sense to just cut that documentation out of the process, just handle it out of capital funds, because we already know. That our liquid fuels funds are not really covering all of even our like roadway needs going forward.
Right, so that was, I think, the question that Mike was just asking. is that-
I just did it in artfully.
But right, so the idea is that we would just be doing the streetlights documentation out of liquid fuels for this year only.
Okay, I gotcha.
But moving forward, but again, I was explaining, so the $69,000 is only a quarter of what we would spend otherwise in our annual road program, which is why I think it's better and cleaner to just look at the general fund budget as we go forward with our.
We spend more than that money anyway.
Yeah,
so.
we're spending it
Yes.
either way,
Yeah.
but this way we're offsetting the transfer from general to liquid fuels by then taking those expenditures that we would otherwise pay out of general fund and paying them through liquid fuels. So it essentially nets any change. So we're still paying for the electrical bills,
Yeah.
just paying them out of liquid fuels, but just for this year only. And then next year we'll go back to our standard administrative practice. And then we'll look at what we need for our liquid fuels program moving forward. And then we just budget that out of our general funds in a totality, as opposed to carrying over the $69,000 forward.
Okay, so this, yes, all right, that makes sense. This was just a one.
It's a one-time thing.
Got it, thank you.
Do you need any authorization from us for any of these transfers?
No, that was just more as an FYI, but you gave the okay to do the 500,000. And again, that was already in the budget. So we've discussed it at a public meeting. And so I will proceed with that. Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to, well, these are action items.
Should we knock out the schedule of bills really?
Well, how do we want to, what order do we want to do these?
Just get through this, and then the next discussion item is our
Alright.
zoning recut, and we'll have Adam.
Okay, A, scheduled bills.
I'd like to recommend approval of scheduled bills for general capital sewer and solid waste funds totaling $740,356.77.
Second.
Okay, discussion. Scheduled bills.
Seen anything in here that's unusual?
Makes sense.
Okay. All right, so nothing to say about scheduled bills. Let's vote to approve. Is 3-0. Bills are through or recommended for approval. Okay. Again, I'm going to pause and see whether we want to. Yeah, is this where we get to Adam?
Yes.
Okay, so our next item would be authorization to advertise zoning recodification. So should we get a motion for this? And then.
Motion to recommend tabling the advertisement ordinance 10-7.
But for tabling, can we still discuss it?
Sure,
Yes.
yeah.
Okay.
So I'll second
Second
it.
the motion
Now
to
we-
table.
Now we can discuss.
All right.
Hello, Adam.
And here we are. Adam Shantz is here, who is our from Montgomery County Planning Commission. Thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Great. So we are here to ask questions about the zoning recodification, the policy neutral zoning recodification, which we have a draft that we're looking at, and we asked you here to answer any questions, comments we have this time. But
Maybe I can just start with a very general one.
yeah,
So there's a lot of discussion in the document about sort of what the original, a lot of this cleanup is to sort of match the original intent when we went to the form-based zoning code.
Yes.
I didn't really get a sense of how we determine that original intent. I don't know, like, we can tell from obviously not necessarily from the document itself, although in some places I think it's obvious. But there were some places where I felt like, oh, there's kind of, it says, here's the original intent, so here's how we're filling it in. And it just wasn't clear to me in some cases, like how we figured that out. I don't know if you can address that just generally as an overview.
Yeah, so I mean that essentially it was an interpretation of what the original intent of the code was. I mean, we didn't want to drastically change anything. We just wanted to clarify anything that might be, unclear or that's why we added definitions where they were lacking, updated definitions, we tried to make this restructure, a reorganization, but as we were going through, we noticed things and tried to clean them up. But if you have like a specific example where that was not clear, I'm happy to talk about it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there were, like, for example, I think there's a situation where we assume that something was inadvertently omitted from one section versus the other.
Sure.
And how did we figure that one out? Because that's not obvious. To me, it wasn't as obvious from the document itself.
Okay, I'm trying just based on just not knowing exactly what you're referring to, but yes, there were a couple of areas where we had to make some assumptions, but then we outlined the changes that we made and why, and documented them for Planning Commission and for you all to see what we did. And of course, we welcome feedback if you view it differently. I mean, this is supposed to be kind of an iterative process. Ultimately, I mean, Todd and I are not the decision makers here. We did our best to kind of clarify and interpret the code as we could. But if you have additional context or anything like that, and you disagree, we're open to any of your questions or comments. This is your document.
I think I might have an example of that. Right?
Yeah,
so
no, I imagine you might. Go ahead.
So y'all had flagged, for instance, that so the way because we have a form-based code, it operates on the basis of definitions of building types
Yes.
and definition of uses, right?
Yep.
So we know, so the code as it exists has a definition for one family dwelling, which is a use.
Yep.
Definition for two family dwelling, which is a use.
Yep.
And definition for multiple family dwelling, which is a use. And the
Yes.
definition of a multiple family dwelling, by definition in the code today, is 3 plus families, i.e. 3+ units in a structure as a use.
Yes,
And then we have the building types, which are different, right?
yes,
And so multiple family house was its own building type, and the definition of that was listed as a house structure with 2 to 5 units in it.
correct.
When you look at the regulation tables, it says because it tells you what types of buildings you can have certain uses in. It says 1 family and 2 family uses are only allowed in a detached house. I think that was probably the primary one.
Mhm.
And so multiple family as a use, which again is defined in the code as 3+ units, was allowed in a multi-family house. So the definition of the multi-family house, which is 2 to 5 units,
Yes,
but 2-family use as a use is not actually allowed
Right.
in that structure. So I guess to the point, like you have this inconsistency, and I guess in that instance, you're probably deferring to what the regulatory tables actually say. Because there's no instance in the existing code as is where you could have a 2-family multi-family house, even though the definition
yes.
says, oh, that's theoretically possible, the regulations don't actually allow.
They don't allow it. So yeah. So and also yeah. So I think there is a very good example, and also the definitions were a bit conflicting for detached house versus multifamily house. Detached house 1 to 2 designated for 1 to 2 families versus a multifamily house designated for 2 to 5 families. Well, how do you determine for a 2-family house if that's a detached house or a multifamily house? So ultimately, we wanted to clarify that. I mean, obviously you can by the uses, but it was a bit conflicting.
So that's sort of a good example. Okay, so it's conflicting. So how did we decide what we really meant?
Well, in that case, I think it's decided because you take the thing that you couldn't actually do under code
right.
Yeah.
And make
and
doable.
say and clarify that, okay, well, if the code says in theory you can do something and then you're just not allowed to do it, then the code in its totality
Right.
says that you're not allowed to do it. And that probably is the question.
Yeah. Okay.
Because there was a couple other, I think, moments where there was one I mentioned to Jim earlier where it's like the code theoretically says, oh, you can have dry cleaners in the 4A district.
Yes, yes.
Mixed use or commercial
Right.
building in a conditional use, but then the conditional use says you can only have it if the building was built prior to 1920. There's no commercial or mixed use buildings that are built prior to the 1920s, so therefore you can't actually have a dry cleaner in the 4A district.
Right.
So-
So the assumption is you meant to allow it.
Or if you're just doing like a content neutral recodification, the content is you're not actually allowed to have that use today.
Yeah,
So-
if it's saying that you're allowed to do something, but in actuality you could not do that, then we should clean it up. So that was another example, kind of like with civic institutional buildings within 500 feet of Narber Station. There are none since Baptist Church no longer exists. So we cleaned up that part of the code to eliminate that provision because it didn't apply any longer.
Yeah. So I think and that's separate from the question of with some of these at a future date, we may want to say, actually, well, this seems fine, but then that's technically a change from the way that the code exists and operates today.
Yeah, so given that we've moved to table this, we probably don't want to get into very specific stuff right now because we're gonna have some more work on this.
Yeah.
But maybe if we have some more general questions, maybe organizational formatting questions or.
Yeah, I guess I do have some
Yeah.
organizational formatting questions, which is for the uses, right? I've said in some sections, the use regulations are repeated several times. And from a just structural element, that gives me some concern because whenever we repeat something, we raise the probability that in the future, an amendment amends one section but misses the amendment to the other section. And
Sure.
then it those sections continue to diverge and create inconsistencies. And so like with, for instance, I think the thing that stood out, some of the special exceptions, like those use regulations in some cases are repeated up to 4 times in different sections. And so I wanted to just think about that. And maybe that'd be something that we just take a look at to reduce that complexity and reduce the possibility that in the future we, miss something. If 10 years down the line they're amending it, like not have it so that people 10 years from now have to know exactly every single section, but that they're really mostly looking at a more delimited number of sections that have the same regulatory purpose. That makes sense.
Yeah. No, that is very, very good feedback. So we're going to go through and double check and try to reduce the repetitiveness.
Adam,
Which I think we did a lot, but there are places that we missed. Yeah.
Is there ever a case for repetition? Like, to see something more than one time? Or is that just sort of, inadvertent structural?
Well, I think in the current code, there's a lot of repetition, but our goal was to kind of eliminate that. Now, there is a little bit of repetition between, in the zoning districts, we're talking about uses, then we have a uses table. So there's going to be a little bit of repetition, but trying to eliminate unnecessary repetition where it's not actually serving a purpose, that makes sense.
So I guess in terms of and so this is just a question, in terms of the big uses table, right? So
yeah,
the way the current code operates, we have these appendices to the zoning code.
Yep.
We have certain things that live in the appendices. And I just mentioned that to say, if the uses regulations, right? Because one of the concepts to make it easier on a user basis is that if you're in 3B, you can flip to the 3B quarterback section and it quarterbacks you to the other areas of the code that are relevant. But you can see at a high level, these are the uses unallowed, these are the building sections allowed. So a question in terms of with the mega table of uses, if that content is found in the district regulation itself, rather than the mega table being just kind of duplicating that in a big table, is that something that would operate better as an appendix to the code, both in order to try to keep the code clean and also to make it more user friendly? Just that I wanted to just toss that out there as a concept.
That's a good idea. Yeah, if you can get all of that information from each of the zoning districts, then it is more supplemental than absolutely necessary to the code. So it could be an appendix. That's an interesting idea that I want to think about and play around with.
While we're talking about tables, was there, I can't remember, Todd once said that they weren't necessarily concentrating on mending tables, but I really enjoy the tables, and I feel like when I was going through looking for different use standards in the different zones, I felt like a lot of those that are initially listed, there's some that are listed under by special exception, some that are listed with performance standards, some that are listed with distance standards, but I know there's a lot of overlap between those. Some things might have distance standards and performance standards, or might be. I didn't know whether special exception was considered a performance standard or not. I don't think so. Especially in our code, it's not. I thought maybe that would better be served by a table. A table of uses that showed, this use requires a special exception, has performance standards, has distance standards, and it'll all be sort of neatly laid out there rather than in headings, because that was sort of what seemed confusing to me when I got through, tried to follow a use through the code. I quickly got tripped up by sort of the initial statement of what what the performance standards and the special exception standards were.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean we have a table for kind of uses and their special exceptions and conditional uses. But yeah, I think there was a recommendation that I saw about including performance standards within the zoning districts that could clear up
Yeah.
your question. So yeah, we're gonna look at that.
That makes sense. And yeah, there's probably other things that may be unresolvable now that we need to resolve in the future. The one that comes to mind is the definition of like multifamily house, like we just covered. We're carrying that forward as is, because that's the way it is. But we also know that we have the dentist office project downtown that we approved. And we passed an amendment to allow that effective use to occur. But then that kind of means that those provisions that allow you to do those commercial uses may or may not be consistent with the definition of multifamily. I don't know that that's something that would resolve for this, but just there's probably gonna be some of those things that we also just flag as additional, may not.
Yeah, we flagged a lot for future policy change review. So there are a lot of things that we did not include that were more policy related.
So given that there's going to be more work on this, do we want to set up some kind of council involvement in this? Like, if we have 2 or 3 council members?
Working group.
Yeah, is that possible? Sort of-
So I want to make sure that the actual drafting stays with our contract planner
Meet
who's
with them.
been working, understood.
Yeah.
But even still, I think what would be most helpful is if you want to send your feedback, thoughts and questions to me, and I can compile that and share that with Adam. And that we can work through some of those with him directly. I just want to make sure we're not
Too many cooks.
I'm trying to make sure that we're not kind of changing the parameters at the last minute here, since this is a review of what's been going on for the better part of 10 months now. So I want to make sure that we address all outstanding questions, and obviously we want to make sure that the final product is as complete and clear as possible, since the purpose of this whole exercise for the past year has been to come up with a clearer plan. So I think the most appropriate course of action, because we had our steering committee meetings, we've reviewed the whole process, so we're now at the stage in the process where we're providing the last review and edit. So I think if you just want to pass all of your questions, comments on to me, and then we can work that through with Adam.
Yeah, I think so. And some of these things, I think, are things that were brought up early in the process as well. And so I think it's important just making sure we're delivering on the kind of the stated overall goals of the recodification process.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, happy to provide feedback however helps. But I'm definitely I know that just I want us to feel good about the
Sure.
content, and y'all have done the lion's share, really the yeoman's work of getting it to this stage, and now we're doing kind of review and kind of refinement and just kind of checking on it.
Sure.
Which is also important in the process.
Yeah.
So wanted just to touch base on timelines so we kind of understand the process moving forward. In speaking with Adam, hearing the comments and feedback, we do feel confident that we can wrap this up ahead of next month's meeting cycles. So if that's the case, then what we're looking at is a May 1st deadline for the final draft to come to us from MCPC. That would mean then that we would want all of our comments in. Adam, you tell me when do you want all comments in so that they can be incorporated so that you can then turn around the draft by the 1st?
Sure. I'd love to have comments in, by next week. Yeah, the sooner you can get them, the better. But yeah, I'll accept them through next week.
Okay, so we'll say if we can, I mean, if we can get all comments in by, first thing Monday morning, like if you, any comments, send them to me by, Sunday night, first thing Monday morning, we'll turn those around, get them to Adam. That'll give him 2 weeks then to draft everything. I know that he's already received a couple of comments and feedback, so he has some things to start working on. And then we'll be able to distribute the draft then. It won't be in its final form, so we still have our solicitor review of the changes. So we also want to make sure that we have enough time for our solicitor to review those. So the May 1st deadline is then when we're going to turn around and send that to our solicitor for review. So then he'll have 2 weeks for the review, and then to draft that into its formatted ordinance form ahead of our May 15th deadline to have packets sent out ahead of the May 18th FNA meeting and the May 21st council business meeting. If for whatever reason we need more time with it, we need to know that ahead of time. Like we need to know that as soon as possible so we can modify our schedule, because we are proceeding with all of our consultants with this schedule. If things are going to change, I need to communicate that with them so that they can shift their schedules around. So I do anticipate that we will be able to proceed with this next month. But again, if there's more questions that come up, we want this process done right, then done quickly. However, we've been putting a lot of effort into this and we feel we're in a good spot with this last bit of feedback to be able to meet the deadline for next month.
Yeah, so I guess like if it's gonna cause like if it's gonna cause a fire drill, if we needed more time. I would just personally say, why don't we just err on the side of more time? Just so there's clarity up front, so that we're not having a fire drill and then another fire drill. Because it's a big document. And it'll give us more time to do like our review of the final draft when it gets in, and Adam won't have to kill himself like incorporating a lot of comments in a short time frame. And I guess a different topic, but if we're intended to also start talking about policy stuff in May, it seems like to have the recodification at the same time might also just be confusing for folks, and having those on 2 different agendas maybe is cleaner, just generally.
So we don't currently anticipate any ordinance amendments in May.
No, but we were gonna have a policy, we're gonna have like a policy discussion, right? Even
At
though we're not
workshop.
having ordinance.
At workshop.
Sure.
But I get what Mike's saying. If we do it at workshop and then 2 weeks later, people see a zoning thing on our agenda, they're gonna assume it's based on what we're policy changes
We
in
should keep
workshop.
stating, making clear that
Yeah.
that's not the case.
I mean,
right?
I've been saying it till I'm blue in the face, but it doesn't seem to get anywhere with the public. Yeah, I worry, I sort of agree with Michael that like Monday is tight, right? So finish getting through this, if that's what you need, Adam, to feel confident that you can get it by May 1st. I feel like I don't know how, I mean, we've got Dana and Fred in the room, maybe it's worth hearing from them whether they think Monday they feel comfortable getting everything that they want to say about this by May 1st. Or by Monday.
Mike, I would just caution, they're not here as members of
I know.
council, but as members
I
of
know,
the public.
I know. But.
Well, our rules do allow us to ask
Yeah.
questions of visiting members.
Yep.
I think Fred is a non-voting member of every committee.
Right, so.
I don't really have anything to add on the timeline. I've already made my comments and they're mostly very technical. I'm confident that they could be made in the time that is provided. I don't have anything really substantive. But Dana certainly does, so.
So
You
I
can hear from Dana, I think. Would you like to say anything? Mayor?
So I think I I hear kind of all the different sides of it. What I've noticed is when one part of a document like this gets touched, it sort of ripples over to here, and then you have to kind of like refine and kind of think about things like that. You're moving tables. That can be, or not saying anything of Adam's ability to move a table, but when you do that, sometimes it has different meanings, sometimes rows get lost, things happen. I think you need to take the time that you think you need. I've given a pretty big list. A lot of it might just be discounted, I don't know, but like or explained. But it's at least a list of kind of the current version. And I anticipate having a list of the next version, just because, you know, I want this to be done right. So we avoid any legal mess, and so we don't have to do it again for a long time. So I'm under no time pressure. But, you know, it's more council than mayor, I think.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to add additional process, because I know that this has been very intensive. But I do have the concern, because just if the idea is, oh, well, if we need additional time, we can take it, and it is a big document. What I don't want us to do is fire drill, everyone gets stressed out, we need more time.
Right.
Fire drill,
Right.
everyone gets stressed out again.
Well,
And or worse, like show up with a document that's 99% right, but somebody says, I don't want to approve this because I feel like I didn't have the opportunity to fully vet it and understand it. And I'm sort of at that point for myself right now. You know, will I feel comfortable seeing it, you know, for May? I don't know. I certainly don't think that I'm gonna be in a position to get all comments in by month. You know, and I don't wanna be in a position where it's like, oh, I didn't get it in, and then it's like somehow I have now forfeited my right to spend the time when I have the time, which is after next week, to, you know, really bear down on it. And quite frankly, I am not a zoning person, so, you know, I would also like the time to talk to Michael, because he's
Right.
kind of the person I rely on to help me understand these things.
right, well, so we're council people, we're not, this isn't really our job to sort of micromanage, you know.
Right,
micromanage. We do have professionals working.
Right, right, it's not
volunteers,
managing,
but,
it's
Yeah.
playing it so
I
that
understand,
we
yeah.
understand, like, oh,
Yeah.
is this a legitimate concern or not, or am I misunderstanding what this is?
So my feeling is the May timeline seems good to me. As long as we, you know, as long as there's like, we get another iteration. Is the opportunity for us to see like another iteration before it formally moves to the packet, or is that kind of,
So the draft will be ready by the 1st. It won't be formatted because that's the solicitor's role. So the current draft that we have before us was sent to the solicitor for his comment. So we'll just revise that and get all of his comments in also by, you know, by the end of this week. And then that will get incorporated into the May 1st. So the May 1st draft then would theoretically, I mean, we said end of day May 1st, so really it would logistically be available on Monday, the 4th. So we could then have the draft. It won't be in the format though, right? So what we'll have is just the draft that's been prepared, which is just kind of in the Word format, not in the ordinance format. So theoretically, that could be then made available. But again, that's the 2 week of the solicitor review prior to then the packet. So there would be that 2 week, and that would be the 2 weeks that the solicitor is formatting that ordinance.
so that's a period where we could have a look at it to see what work has been done in response to our comments as well?
Yes.
Sort of, okay, does that help?
It does, but it doesn't solve for like one of my other concerns, which is like, do we want to set up a process that's fire drill? And I guess like, because my global question with that is, this being a big document, like if we're doing effectively the same thing, but we're giving Adam a bit more time to actually like integrate stuff, And we're giving ourselves a little bit more time to just digest. Then I don't know, and we know that May is gonna be a big month as is. So we're like adding additional big things onto our plate. Like, I feel like I don't see what like the downside to just having like a little bit
Of breathing.
of breathing room on this highly technical, large undertaking. Is.
I mean, I kind of agree with Mike, but I feel like we're not learning from our mistakes, right? Like we keep doing this where we push the agenda and then end up taking things off the agenda. And I think we better safe than sorry, you know, if you don't have enough time, you don't have enough time, and now you've messed yourself up. If you give yourself more time, there's no such thing as too much time in this context, I think. It might be in other contexts, but in this context, I don't think there's a downside to giving us more time than it may turn out what we.
Yeah, and I'm not trying to like weigh this process down. I think I was probably, when I was on the commission, I think I was the first person to say we should recodify the zoning code. It's gotten really messy. I really want this to get done. I want us to get done where I feel pretty confident that we're not having to like come back immediately and do like additional amendment. Like we're gonna have to do some, there's gonna be something that gets, we're gonna have to do some sort of cleanup. That's just attendant to these sorts of things. I just wanna reduce the amount of that we might be having.
So one danger of that is this becomes an open-ended process, you know, where.
That's not what I
No,
like, that is not at all what.
Yeah, no, we just are gonna, you extend the time frame to make it for June instead of for May, that's what we're saying, right?
Yeah,
I think that's what you're saying.
yeah, I mean, I like, if we wanna set like, have comments in by X. You know, we can set those milestones. It seemed, the turnaround seemed.
I guess take the scenario, if we get it back May 1st. We have comments, John's working simultaneously. Now what happens if there's something that we think needs to be changed? How's that gonna get done before the meeting? Because John has to actually integrate that. When are we gonna have the opportunity to say that is something that we wanna tweak or change or whatever? I don't see where that flows in the process.
Yeah, cause I'm thinking as well, like, my review of the second document, what I would probably do is. The first thing I would do is I would go back and I would. Recheck all of the things that I flagged before, just to like do that initial check. To make sure, because I'm sure they would all get reviewed, but that's just how my brain works, is like, first let me check the things I already saw, then I would go back and do another check through. And that seems like. A lot to do in a short time frame, and I imagine that probably, if I'm Adam, I would imagine that like. Reviewing all of like the comments that have gotten sent to him is probably. A long problem set in itself,
Yeah.
and integrating those things is probably a long problem set. in
Sure.
itself.
But if we're gonna have another council person look at this, if there's another product, we want them to sort of stay on that timeline, of getting something out by May, so we can look at it again. You know what I mean? Like, if we extend this deadline to June, doesn't that sort of push all the drafts?
Oh, I'm not saying
No,
get comments
I-
in by June, I'm saying get comments in way before that, like,
Yeah, no, I would just like sort of push each deadline out a little bit. Give more space in between each step, in other words, instead of Monday, say, next
Yeah.
Friday or whatever it is. That give Adam till the 8th, like it, sort of push everything back, give a little more space between each step.
So when would we realistically see a next iteration of this, so that we can have a look at it, so that we, to our satisfaction, with the potential that they'd have to go back and produce another, to absorb more comments, like when is that?
I think that's up to
I
Adam.
think I would ask Adam.
Yeah, that's, Adam's comfort level based on, let's say, if our comments are extended till, say, next Friday. How much time would he want? And then I would run everything from that date, sort of like a briefing schedule, like, okay, 2 weeks later, this happens, 2 weeks later, this, sort of what Maggie just did, but spreading it out so that it hits June.
Mayor,
Let me make a suggestion that, having a deterministic timeline might lead you back to the same conversation toward the end. Here would be my suggestion, you're dealing with a very large, complex document that some people have read, some people haven't. Levels of technicality inside of that are very difficult. The ability to process all of the feedback, so be it Adam and team, and the ability to process the document, provide feedback. So what you might consider is like 1 week intervals, right? Like all comments for this version due on Monday, then we get a turnout on Friday. People get to read it over the weekend, then maybe Monday, and then go to Friday. Like some interval like that. What you'll see is the comments drop
yeah,
very
sure.
quickly.
I
I
don't-
don't know when that is.
Yes. but I don't know what their schedule for review and produce, their ability and appetite for producing different drafts are,
Yeah, so like Adam, in terms of the stuff that you've seen, because I know that I.
What I've
had-
seen, yeah, what I've seen so far is I need 2 weeks to turn that around. Of the comments that I anticipate to receive, as well as what I've seen so far. So, yeah, if you were going to get me all of your comments by the 24th, I could produce a draft by the 8th of May, and then I would hope that there would be fewer comments after that.
the 24th is next Friday.
I mean, that seems. That seems reasonable.
But that sounds like an open-ended.
Well, I do think the comment of like, the next batch is probably like. Exponentially lower than the first batch. Like, I do think that it's not gonna be like, we're just looking, we're not going up in terms of the number of comments, most likely. Unless something's going horribly wrong, and we're probably not linear downward, it's probably exponential downward, would be my guess.
Okay, if I'm gonna analogize to my life, my professional life, it's like every draft of a brief. The edits are, the first edit, the first draft takes you forever, the next edit takes a little less time, the next edit is like literally, finding semicolons instead of columns. And
Sure, but we're working with, we're inviting council members, 7 council members to keep having
but it's
some, like if we. Okay,
yeah, so you're inviting council members to take a review. Some of us probably, on the next round might not take another cut, but be like, I was satisfied with the first round.
Yeah.
I'll leave it to others to make sure that something didn't accidentally get put in, right, or something. I guess, Jim, what's your concern that, because I don't want to leave it open-ended.
That it becomes
right?
open-ended, that it starts overlapping with other important business, that people become confused and sort of lose the plot, maybe members of the public, and just the interest that this be done, we move on from this. I think it's high, but I want to hear from Maggie too. Thanks.
Ultimately, as I said, we want this done correctly. So just working backwards, if we're assuming a June advertisement for adoption, that's June 18th. Which means that our packets are done by June 12th. And we're gonna need to have whatever the final draft is to our solicitor 2 weeks ahead of time. So that'll go out to him first thing, June 1st, that's a Monday. So that means that the draft needs to be like done, complete, no more changes by June 1st.
Yeah.
Which means then that gives us until May 29th for whatever iterative process you want. So if Adam is saying that he can turn around a draft by May 8th. Comments into him by April 24th, that's a Friday. Turnaround for revised draft by Friday, May 8th. Then if we allow another week for comments by the 15th, that gives Adam then 2 more weeks to incorporate final comments. And that means then that we can turn around and give our solicitor the draft by June 1st, which means then that we'll have that draft in its final format for an ordinance by the 12th, ahead of the June 18th meeting, where we then advertise it for adoption. It goes out for advertisement, and then we schedule our public hearing at the July 16th meeting. So we'll have the hearing, close the hearing, and then move to adopt the ordinance
Right.
June 18th.
And
Or July, I'm sorry,
for
July
anyone listening to
16th.
this meeting out there, this is the policy neutral recodification we're talking about. We're not talking about anything, any zoning changes. Just, okay, for future reference.
Yeah.
Fred,
I'm just gonna suggest that if we're doing it this way, where individual council members are giving feedback, I think it would be good to allow somebody, either Maggie or Adam, to be a gatekeeper and say,
Yeah,
I don't
Definitely.
think that this change is warranted
Yeah.
because of this, because, it's one thing if council directs it as a vote, if 4 members of the council say so, the change is gonna be made. But an individual council member, I think we need to have some sort of judgment in the process to make sure that the changes don't overwhelm the document.
Yeah.
And if, if somebody, in the expert opinion of, I don't know, Maggie, or somebody, we need to empower somebody to say, I recognize what you're saying, but I don't feel this change is needed at this time, and we're gonna proceed, because otherwise they could just be overwhelmed by it.
And I would posit that as our consultant, council should not be reaching out directly to Adam, because that's a lot of people reaching out to him. Please have everything come through me, and then I will forward everything through Adam. And then if you have specific questions, we can have a discussion on that, and Adam can explain, this decision was made, because mind you, we are 10 months into this process.
Mhm.
So he's the one who can explain, we decided on this originally because. Now you're raising good points and we'll consider those, but to Fred's point, he is our planning consultant. He is the expert in the room, and we pay him to come up with the best planning practices. But collectively, we're putting our brains together to come up with the best document and address some of the concerns, because that's helpful to then strengthen the document. But please have everything come through me, and then I will be the conduit to our consultant.
is everybody comfortable with that schedule?
And I'm also happy to discuss individual points. If we have specific items that are sort of debatable, we could talk about those Thursday and see if council is going to direct that change to be made, or council as a whole is comfortable with the current setting. So if there are specific kind of broader points, I'm thinking of several of the points Dana's raised, which I think are larger than like an individual concept. It might be good to have those out of the table, determine, yes, we are going to change those, no, those are okay. Just have it out as a public conversation rather than, since we know already that these are larger scale issues.
Yeah.
Right?
right.
Okay.
And then we make that determination and make sure Maggie lets Adam know.
Yeah, and
that
then anything
this
else
is
that
what-
comes up afterwards,
Yeah.
we allow Maggie to judge or we allow Maggie and Adam to judge whether they be incorporated or not. Just in terms of timeline, because we're not gonna have we're trying to do this in between public meetings. We're trying to get this feedback in between public meetings, so we have to allow a little judgment. So I'll propose this again on Thursday, and make sure that all council agree with this.
Okay, so if I can suggest we then have a collective understanding. So the recommendation then from the committee is to postpone the consideration for adoption of the ordinance until June. And what we'll proceed with is the deadline whereby we'll have comments into me to give to Adam by the 24th.
Yep.
April 24th.
Yep.
Adam will give us a revised draft on the 8th. That will be made available to review. And then we're going to have review comments from the May 8th draft due May 15th. And then we're going to have the next revised draft, May 29th. So that June 1st, the Monday, will go to our solicitor for final formatting. And I will say that our solicitor will be reviewing the drafts as well throughout this process. So the purpose of the June 1st deadline is to give his office the 2 weeks to format this. It is a large ordinance, so to format it in the proper format will take some time. So we want to make sure that we're not rushing them through that process. They'll have 2 weeks. We'll have our final version available on the 12th. And I will say, in terms of making this draft available to the public, we've already made the draft available. So we can make these subsequent 2 drafts that we're expecting on May 8th and then May 29th. I anticipate that those will then be made publicly available in a draft format. And then the draft ordinance that will be advertised for adoption will be part of the council's packet that will be published on the website.
Yeah.
Does that timeline agree with everybody's expectations?
Yes, thank you for outlining that. And also thank you, Adam. I know that our zoning code is like one of the more complicated codes, especially for a borough our size. I just want to recognize that the difficulty of the undertaking and all of the work that we put into it.
Appreciate that.
And that's what we get for being among the first to adopt the formula. So the downside of that is, being the thought leaders of that is that I think we're also the first ones to be like, oops, like there are things.
No.
Yeah. Good. Thanks,
Okay.
Daniel.
All right.
Thank you, Nick.
Well, thanks so much.
Thanks, Adam.
Thank you very much.
And should we conclude this topic by voting to table this along the schedule outlined by the
Add
manager?
that one.
Yeah, okay, all in favor of that? Thank you. We have tabled this.
No, we recommended it.
We recommended to table.
We're just
it.
activating the seething power.
Everything I say, just add recommend to. All right. Let's move on to item C, authorization to advertise ordinance 1071, vegetation and parking amendments. So moved.
So moved.
Second.
Okay.
Okay, so. Oops. So we've drafted ordinance 1071, and again, you do not have the actual formatted draft in front of you today. That will be available prior to Thursday, but the summary of everything is included in the memo in the packet. This is mostly a technical cleanup. So we are amending the trees chapter 462, subsection 5. Right now, the referenced height for minimum tree clearance says 9 feet, but we also have standards in the streets and sidewalks ordinance that says the minimum tree height clearance above sidewalks shall be 8 feet. It is the recommendation of Shade Tree and our Public Works that we maintain an 8-foot minimum height clearance. So we're just simply changing the trees chapter to reflect the streets and sidewalks chapter for uniformity across our ordinance to eliminate any discrepancies. The other one was discussed by Public Health and Safety in more detail over the past few months, but this relates to the vegetation maintenance requirements, again, in our streets and sidewalks chapter. So the borough adopted an amendment a couple years ago to require maximum shrub height of 4 feet within the right of way. We were evaluating what that would actually mean since we are proceeding with a targeted enforcement this year of our vegetation maintenance. Again, this isn't a special program. These are ordinances that we already have on the books that we're simply making a concerted effort to enforce in a more routine and uniform way. And in evaluating the enforcement of that, this was raised as a question as to why this is something that we would want to concern ourselves with. So the decision was made to actually remove the 4-foot height restriction, to just not allow for any maximum or minimum height restriction within the right of way. This is because this affects a lot of properties that have privacy hedges along the front yard. The concern that we do have would be vegetation that obscures sight distance when you're at an intersection. So corner properties at a roadway intersection. This standard in the existing ordinance doesn't quite address those concerns. So in the interest of, property maintenance, we want to remove the 4-foot height restriction. And what we will do moving forward later this year, not related to our efforts as part of our code enforcement, as part of the current push, but just for future, we're going to be doing a more comprehensive review of our site triangles and vegetation at corners and intersections for safety, visibility, and walkability at a later date. We didn't want to, again, rush through that this time. So we're just removing the 4-foot height. So for anybody out there listening, if you have shrubs or hedges in your front yard in the right of way that exceed 4 feet in height, you do not need to cut them down if council approves this. So that would be that change. The only thing.
Just before, oh, sorry, I thought you were gonna go on.
Oh, no, the only additional modification to that is if you do have shrubs that obscure your front, the front facade of your house, is that you will be asked to just make sure that you have an address sign somewhere visible from the street. And that if you have a walkway, to maintain that walkway in a passable condition so that EMS can find and access your house for safety purposes.
So you were saying for the corner, so that would eliminate any height limitation in corner properties that obscure views coming out, but we'll
Correct.
fix that later.
Correct.
The idea?
Yes.
Okay.
Also
we have that
because-
situation.
Right, because 4 feet at the corner still doesn't address your sight lines. 4 feet is still too high for safety. Most municipalities have limitations between 18 to 36 inches. So at a minimum, we would want people to have a maximum height of 3 feet at a corner, if not less. If you're in a passenger vehicle, your line of sight is about that 3-foot mark. So you cannot see a person walking, and you cannot see another vehicle, especially.
Vehicles around corners.
Right. So the 4 feet doesn't quite address that. And what it does is it introduces a lot more enforcement for interior lot properties because it applies uniformly to all properties, regardless of whether or not you're a corner property. And that would create, and that ordinance does create a lot of non-conforming properties. And we've heard some concerns expressed by people who have intentionally planted privacy hedges, who would be discouraged if they had to cut them down.
That's not what we're necessarily what we're talking about right now. This ordinance doesn't address corner obstructions.
Correct, yeah. So we're going to be addressing that specifically in the future, but currently not right
I'll
now.
make sure it's out there.
We do, the question was raised, we do have other means to enforce safety at intersections. So if there's vegetation or some other condition that creates a safety hazard, we can still address that through our code enforcement mechanisms. But this particular mechanism, the property maintenance provision, doesn't quite do what we need it to do, and just creates a lot of other kind of externalities that are undesirable.
Okay, gotcha. And PHS recommended this evidence, so they've already.
Yes, correct. And then the other two are just updates to tables. So the one had to do with our, it's in our zoning ordinance, it's in the appendices. It's our street dimension standards, which lists all of our cartway widths and our right-of-way widths. This actually came about because the ordinance that we're rescinding, the 4-foot height of vegetation within the right-of-way, people had questions as to what the right-of-way is and how they measure it and how far it goes into their property. So we did an audit of our table to make sure that that information was correct. We did find some discrepancies, so we are simply updating the table to be reflective of true and accurate measurements of all cartway widths and rights-of-way widths throughout the borough. This provision will no longer apply, but the corrections are still desirable.
Right, and this doesn't affect whatever expectations there are to maintain a clear plane on the sidewalk.
Correct, right. So the changes that we're proposing to the streets and sidewalks ordinance, the provision about the 4-foot height in the right of way is independent of the provision to maintain a clear width sidewalk. So if folks have vegetation that encroaches into the width of the sidewalk, then they are still under existing ordinances that are not being touched, will be required to shear those back to maintain a clear passable width of the sidewalk. So imagine, if you will, if you were to put like a plate of clear glass at the edge of the sidewalk going straight up, anything that would be in the way of that kind of vertical line being drawn straight up from the edge of the sidewalk would have to be cut back. So that provision still exists separately from the 4-foot height. So that is on the books already and not proposed to be changed. So in the streets and sidewalks, there's a separate provision about maximum clearance heights of branches above the sidewalk, which is 8 feet, above the street, which is 14 feet. And then a second provision, which addresses the width of sidewalks specifically for any encroachments or overhangs into the sidewalk. And that is like a vertical plane that goes up. So it's not just based on overhangs at the ground level, but you would draw a line straight up. Essentially, like imagine a box, like an 8-foot box above a sidewalk. You have the full width and the full height.
Yeah.
Okay.
This is making me really glad that I'm not on PHS. Because I'm gonna just go with their recommendations. I'm sure they spent a ton of time on this.
And then finally, the last one is we're adding this in because we're up on our deadlines for this. This is the changes to the 2-hour parking. If you recall, we had a petition at the end of last year. We were following our process. So we had the initial petition. We removed the signs. There was a 3-month kind of trial period. And then I've requested the follow-up petition from the residents to formalize that. But this is to then change the ordinance to remove those blocks from the 2-hour parking limits to reflect the changes that were approved by council at the end of last year in response to the petition made by the residents. And that would be for Chestnut and South Essex. And then I believe it was Jim caught that there was something that we had approved in 2024 that didn't get codified. So that was already approved. We're just reflecting that in the codified changes to the code. And that would be for Price Avenue. So that would be some changes in the 300 block of Price that was approved back in 2024.
But I believe the signage reflects this already on the street, right?
The signage is, yes, the signage is correct.
Yeah.
We're just updating the ordinance to reflect that. So again, signage is correct. The enforcement has been correct. Just the ordinance hasn't been changed.
Yeah, we received a petition from folks on the south side to remove regulated parking.
Yep. Okay, that's good. Can we vote in favor of this vegetation parking amendments? All okay. Reading nothing, recommended. Item D, bid award 2026 road program. Motion, please.
So move to recommend. Second.
Okay.
Same thing, right?
Yeah, so we'll just quickly go through this. So this is our 2026 road program. We already looked at the scope of work before and authorized the bids for this. The bids have come back in. We did budget $225,000 in our 2026 highway aid budget for this, and our lowest responsible bidder was T. Schaefer Contractors. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Coming in at a price of $219,466, which is about $5,000, $5,500 less than our budgeted amount, which is great. So we're coming in on target there with our scope of work. So we are simply asking for the committee to recommend that council authorize the bid award to this contractor for that dollar amount.
Yep, cool. Straightforward. All in favor? Opposed? 3, nothing. Recommended. Item E, capital expenditure, park improvements, baseball bleachers.
Move to recommend approval. Second.
All right, so this scope of work was previously discussed in the infrastructure committee. This is reflective of the master parks plan that we adopted in February of last year. So we're starting to implement some of these park improvements. The work that we're planning on for this year is to remove the second of the 2 sets of bleachers closest to I guess closest to Windsor, so on Wynwood, closer to Windsor, that bleacher is set over there. They are in getting to be in a state of disrepair. There's some trees that are encroaching into them, so there's some, safety things. So what the master parks plan had recommended, which we are implementing, is to remove that set of bleachers, remove the concrete pad, and restore the lawn area to a sloped lawn. We will maintain the bleachers closer to home plate. So there will still be bleachers there. We are not planning on doing this scope of work until after the 4th of July. So we don't want to be disruptive for this year. So we want to make sure that all the work is done after the fact, because it takes a little bit for the grass seed to grow. And so we just don't want to interfere with that. Separate from the capital plan, we are going to be doing some tree removal in that area just to take down some of the white pines that are reaching the end of their lifespan. They're dropping limbs and can be a safety hazard. So we're removing those. That is a separate, though, that is coming out of our tree maintenance as opposed to our capital fund, but it's going to be kind of a concurrent project to clear up that area there. So the total cost for the scope of work is going to be tree and stump removal, concrete footer demolition, soil and seed, and then dump fees for the removal or the disposal, of the bleachers. So we're looking at about a $21,000 cost on the budget here. And we did budget in our capital plan this year $30,000 for the scope of work. So again, we're coming in slightly under budget with this project.
Director Jeff mentioned, just in case you guys have any questions, NAA is aware, Dartmouth Outsiders are aware, and an arborist has checked all the trees, because that question came up.
Yes, we did hire an independent third-party arborist to come and inspect all of the trees. So this is not just, and now Jeff he comes from a landscaping background, so he is qualified to make these decisions, but we did hire an arborist just as a second opinion and confirmed that these trees will need to come out. Secondarily, unrelated to this project, but just in the vicinity, a couple of the trees around the Veterans Memorial will also need to come down. So we'll be reviewing what those are, and we're going to want to message that to the community because it's going to be a big change from what you see now to what you're going to see at the end of the year, just because of the tree removal that we're contemplating.
Okay, so let's move forward with the recommendation for this removal of bleachers. Okay, that is 3 to recommend. Item F, approval of escrow return for 202 Dudley Ave.
Move to recommend approval.
Second. That's your turn, yes.
Yeah, so this is escrow that we retained for the site improvement. So this is the financial security escrow, not the professional services escrow. We do actually still have some outstanding balance on the professional services fees. So what I would like to do is to have council authorize the release pending the receipt of final payment of outstanding professional services. But this is the financial security that was for all of the site improvements. This would be for things like the sidewalk restoration, the stormwater, all of that has been reviewed and authorized as complete and full by our engineer. So the project is otherwise complete. We do just have some outstanding professional services that were owed. So I will retain that escrow. So if you would like to authorize release of the escrow, I will still retain it until we're paid in full.
So substitute and to recommend as outlined by the mayor.
Okay, all in favor? That's 3, nothing to recommend approval of escrow return for 202 Dudley. Item G, resolution 2026-08, PennDOT signatory update.
Move to recommend.
Second.
Okay, again, really briefly, this is somewhat of a technicality. So we've done these signatory updates before for the RAS system. This is somewhat different. So under our bridge agreement, we are incurring expenses for various engineering construction management services. So we are currently paying our bridge contractor. That is a direct payment pass through with ECMS. So we're not spending the money until we receive the reimbursement from the state. Same thing with TPD, which is our construction management, construction inspection firm. However, we are paying out of pocket for Amtrak expenses and Pannoni expenses related to the bridge engineering services. We pay those out of pocket, we submit for reimbursement. What happened, if you recall, there was that change to the design plans at the end of last year that required some additional expenditures. And what happened is that there wasn't enough money in the individual phases. So what this is doing is I cannot request reimbursement for our expenses that we've incurred in the construction phase because we overran in the design phase. So what we're doing is we're like pulling money from one phase and putting it in the other phase. So we're not changing the cost of the project. We're not changing any like final dollar values. We're just saying of the money that was allocated in this one bucket, we're moving to this other bucket to account for the cost differences. And then that way PennDOT will be able to release the funds when I request reimbursement. So we just need a signatories update on this. I will be submitting this then to PennDOT as soon as this is signed, and then we can request our reimbursement. So currently we are about 5 months of reimbursements that I haven't been able to submit yet for bridge related expenses. Now, these are smaller expenditures. These are only a couple $1,000s per month in these invoices. This isn't like the $300,000 plus invoices from RoadCon. Again, those are being paid from the state before we pay the contractor. So that's a pay when paid, except for Amtrak and Pannoni, which is a reimbursement style per our contract.
Okay. Does all in favor, signatory updates, that's 3-0. Recommend that. Last item of business, last action item is H, resolution 2026-10 DCNR grant.
Move to recommend.
Second.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is just a resolution to authorize us to apply for the DCNR grant. So we talked about this project before. This is for the Elm Grove Park pedestrian bridge. We applied for the other half of the grant funds through Monco 2040 in March. So this is just applying for the same grant, but through the DCNR grant program for the same project. It's the same project cost as before, but this is the documentation for the resolution to go along with our DCNR grant, which is going to be submitted by April 30th.
Okay, all in favor? 3-0. Recommend. Okay, that concludes our action items. Our first discussion item, facility rental policy.
I'm not sure if the committee would like to table this for today.
We're already at 12:23.
I got nothing to do with it.
I have a huge.
Would you like us to table it?
I would recommend that we table this for the time being.
All right.
I was gonna say, if you want to discuss it, I'll leave. Sorry.
I'm always up for a good facility rental
Yeah.
discussion. All right, committee reports, planning commission, I think we've dispensed with all that. No ongoing projects. 7, public comment. Anybody online here for public comment?
No.
Okay, no public comment. Motion for adjournment, please. So moved.
Second.
All right, all in favor of adjourning? Thank you very much. Adjourned at 12:24 p.m.